This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Boz Digital Labs, and JZ Microphones. So get ready to rock.
Kind of just goes back again to what I was talking about earlier about just how I want to help people through music. I think that there's so many people that can get sounds into the box, but then they don't know what to do with it. They just don't know how to process it and get the sounds that they hear in their head to come out in their mixes. So that's ultimately what I'm trying to do, is just help people get the songs done and then to a point where they're proud of and they'll actually release it. Those songs can have the impact that they should.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. This episode is sponsored by OWC, Otherworld Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, your trusted source for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs for your studio. Let OWC focus on keeping your studio Mac in killer condition so that you can focus on making great music. Why ditch your existing Mac when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and learn how you can supercharge your studio Mac. The speed to create, the capacity to dream. Now find out how awesome your studio can be at OWC. This episode is sponsored by Boz Digital Labs, offering you the coolest plugins for your mixes like the Hoser XT and Plus 10 dB Signature Series. You can transform your drums with Sasquatch Kick Machine or Transgressor, get massive bass with Big Clipper, or add width and depth using Mongoose and Imperial Delay. All Boz Digital Labs plugins are available as fully functioning, no time limit free trials, so you can check them out on your mixes right now. Just go to bozdigitallabs.com or click the link in the show notes of this episode. This episode is sponsored by JZ Microphones with the unique Golden Drop capsule design. The Black Hole Series BH1S and BH2 microphones with the hole in the middle for a one-of-a-kind shock mount combine innovative industrial design with careful craftsmanship to bring a world-class sound to your studio, resulting in a level of quality and detail in your recordings that you won't find in other mics. Go to jzmic.com or click the link in the show notes below and use the limited time coupon ROCKSTAR right now to get an incredible 50% off. Hey Rockstars, welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm your host, Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Mike Indovina, a recording, mixing, and mastering engineer based out of Toronto, Canada. He also runs the website masteryourmix.com, where he shares many of the lessons he's learned throughout his audio career to help thousands of musicians and engineers create better mixes that they're proud of. In addition, he hosts the Master Your Mix podcast, where he has interviewed many top-level audio engineers, including Sylvia Massey, Nick Raskulinecz, David Batra, and many more. With an interest in pop punk and rock music, Mike got his start as a drummer, having spent the first decade of his career playing and touring with bands. He originally got into recording as a way of capturing new song ideas. However, that quickly evolved into a career-long passion that has led him to working in the audio industry ever since. Never one to shy away from new opportunities, Mike's skills have taken him into many areas of the field, including working in recording studios, audio post-production, live sound, and more. And most recently, Mike released a brand new book called The Mixing Mindset, the step-by-step formula for creating professional rock mixes from your home studio. This book quickly became a #1 bestseller on Amazon, and it aims to provide people with a complete understanding of the tools, workflow, and mindset needed to create polished mixes with confidence, speed, and ease. So I'm excited to dig into making records and particularly rockstars helping you out with your mixing struggles today on the podcast. Please welcome Mike Indovina to Recording Studio Rockstars. Mike, are you ready to rock, dude?
Hell yeah, man. Let's do this.
Dude, so very cool to have you here on the show. I know you're up in Canada. I'm down here in Nashville. Just as we got going there, we were chatting about whether it's still snowy up there, but I think spring has finally come, right?
It's finally coming. I can't wait.
Cool, man. Cool. And Toronto, I wouldn't have to get deep into it, but I was mentioning I've spent some time in Toronto and I was really impressed with it. It's a super cool city. It's where North by Northeast, the festival, like Canada's answer to South by Southwest, takes place. It's a major film hub, and I think there's a ton of recording and music going on up there, right?
Absolutely. There's tons of music. The film industry is booming, especially with TIFF. That brings a lot of big name movie stars and stuff in. Yeah, it's just a wicked city. There's tons to do out here.
I love that you said wicked city. Was that just because you know I'm from Boston originally?
I did not.
It's a wicked piss of city. Cool, man. Well, tell us a little bit more in your own words about how you got started out in recording and, who you are.
For sure. So I got started in music as a drummer. I've been drumming for about 25 years now, I believe. And so just originally started playing drums just for fun, kind of as a competition with a friend of mine who he was like the cool kid in school. And, he was the one that was getting all the girls and stuff like that. So I was like, you know what, man, like I'm going to show you up. I'm going to get into drumming and show you I can do better. And it was just like total childish thing, but got me into drumming and I fell in love with it. And then as I got into high school, I started playing in bands and just started playing shows and fell in love with that whole part of it. And, I kind of really wanted to pursue that rock star life and play in front of thousands of people and do whatever I could. And fortunately, I joined a band later in high school. We were called Cheap Suits. It was like a ska punk band. And
nice.
We got a distribution deal through Universal in Canada, and we were just touring around Canada as much as possible.
That's exciting.
But yeah, it was great. It was a lot of fun. But somewhere along the lines, I got really frustrated with the process of songwriting because what would happen is our band would get together once or twice a week to jam, and we'd work on all these ideas, and we'd work on arrangements and come up with all these cool parts, and we'd spend hours and hours workshopping it, and then we'd leave practice basically just hoping that we could remember it next time we got together. And inevitably, the next time we got together, we'd forget everything. Or we'd go back to like the first version of the arrangement, and then we'd have to spend hours just trying to fix it up again. And we'd lose all of that original magic. So that's what got me into recording. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I want to just capture this and remember it.
Yeah.
And then we can all learn the songs and come back and just, keep moving from there instead of going backwards. So that's what originally got me into it. And then I started loving it. Like the more and more I dug into it, the more I got interested in it. And I started finding local bands just to reach out to. And, I would say, hey, like, I'll record your band if you buy me a mic, or like, I'll do it for a compressor or something like that.
I know that routine. I know that
yeah, right? Like
conversation,
making no money at all off of it, but just trying to get going and try to build that experience. And it was a great way to build up the studio and to get some experience. And so I just continued doing as much as I could with that. I eventually went to school. I went to a place called Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, Canada, which is a pretty cool music school. They're heavily based in production. And they had some awesome engineers working out of there as well. There was a guy named Jack Richardson, who's a very famous producer. His son, Garth Richardson, did like the first Rage Against the Machine records and all that kind of stuff. But Jack, he discovered the Guess Who. He worked with like Alice Cooper, Bob Seger, some other big names. There were a couple other teachers there as well that were really great to learn from. And just immerse myself in as much as I could there. And ultimately, when I graduated, that's when I feel the learning really started. And like working in studios, seeing how things actually worked in the real world. And I remember one of my first days interning at a studio in Toronto, I introduced myself to the head engineer, and he's like, oh, what's your background? Did you go to school or anything like that? I said, yeah, I just graduated. And he's like, awesome. Well, forget everything you just went to school for and forget all the lessons you learned there, because we do things totally different here. And I kind of remember in that moment being like, what? Like, how? That makes no sense to me. And sure enough, like that day I learned so many things I was told not to do in school, like driving preamps and using condenser mics on drums and all sorts of stuff that like the school was like, don't do that, because they were afraid that we'd ruin their gear.
Right.
But if you do it properly, then you can get some awesome results. And so after that, it was just a matter of just immersing myself and learning from as many people as possible and try to take on whatever opportunities came my way. And that ultimately led to me working in recording studios, doing some live sound work. I was doing front of house and monitors, tour managed. I worked in audio post-production, but kind of just with time and experience, I realized like I love having a home base and being home and working with bands. And that's what led to me just focusing on the studio instead.
Well, groovy. So, what's funny is you talk about the ska band and the frustration of songwriting. And I was thinking, in my brain, I was imagining you're like, hey guys, could this next song could we do this one maybe not with the ska beat and on the upbeat thing? And did you have somebody
we were
like,
such a non-ska band.
A non-ska band?
We were known as a ska band because we had one song called Ska Saved My Life, but that song in itself was not a very ska song. Like we didn't have any horns or anything like that.
Yeah.
It was much more like punk and pop and soul influence, but had a little bit of a reggae thing in there, I guess.
Did you have the guy who would go on the mic and go chick, 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 chick,
oh, yeah.
do that whole thing?
Yeah. I think that was what made us a ska band.
There you go. Yeah, gotta have that. I remember the first time I saw a ska band play and he did that, and I was like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that chick, chick.
Yeah, the chick, chick. See, I wasn't in a ska band, so I don't have that dialed in like you do.
Yeah.
Well, very cool, man. So, I like to also ask our guests to come on the show and share an inspirational quote to kind of kick off the episode. And I liked what you said about, having to unlearn things that you learned in school. But I wonder, if you have a quote that would get us kind of excited for hitting the studio.
Yeah, sure. One of my favorite quotes that I think about all the time is from my favorite movie, which is called The Bronx Tale. I feel like not too many people know about it, but it's a fantastic movie. Everyone should watch it. But the quote is, "The saddest thing in life is wasted talent. You can have all the talent in the world, but if you don't do the right thing, then nothing happens. But when you do right, guess what? Good things happen." And so I always think about that. Like, I feel like everybody has a gift, everyone has a talent, and you should use it to the fullest of your abilities, whether that's being a musician, a photographer, even if you're good at just crunching numbers and working in an accounting firm or something like that. Like, if you have those skills and you can do good with it, absolutely take advantage of that and pursue it. Yeah,
that kind of reminds me, I don't know that I remember exactly what the quote was, but it's something like the road to success is littered with the bodies of talented geniuses or whatever. In other words, the same idea, like you when you're in this and you're creating for a while and you're working on music and making records, initially maybe you begin by seeing that, so-and-so seems really talented. So-and-so's like, maybe I'm not as talented or whatever, or maybe I'm really talented, but so-and-so's not as talented. And then over time, you begin to see that also the people who really use their talents and put them to use start moving forward and progressing. And then one day, the tables are completely turned and you're like, oh, wait, my buddy who, for me, I was the older sibling. So I picked up an instrument and learned how to play something first. Then my brother learned how to play piano. And I remember at the very beginning, I was like, oh, he's not so good. I'm much better, But then I kind of like would rest on my laurels, and he would he would keep working hard at it. And then one day I hear him play and I was like, holy crap. He's so far advanced from where I am. And it just reminds me of what you're saying, that idea of like just using your talents and putting it to use and really being consistent with it and working on your skills.
Absolutely. And it just motivates you, right? If you're doing something that you enjoy doing, you're going to want to pursue it even further.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess you just told the story about being in a band and then realizing what you didn't like about the band to switch to recording. It took me a while to learn that recording was something I wanted to do. I didn't do a band. I did 4 years of architecture college, finished, got my degree, and graduated, and then never worked a single day as an architect. I just realized after playing in a band after school, I was like, wait a minute. The thing that I really loved doing was playing music all through school. And sometimes it's hard to know right away what it is that you really love.
Absolutely. I think for me, like, I guess I was in the same boat. Like, I thought that I was going to get into like marketing or something as well. And I didn't really know. I also had an interest in TV and technology and stuff. And I kind of, in high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to pursue. But I think a major moment for me was when I was playing in bands. I had this one show. And after the show, these two girls came up to me and they're like, hey, we want you to see something. And they showed me that they got.
Hey, where's the story going, man?
It's a PG story, don't worry. But they ended up getting matching tattoos of my band's logo, and I was like, "What? Like, why? Why? I don't even have that." And it turns out that they became friends at one of my band's shows, and they bonded over a lot of things. And they bonded over the fact that they were both actually suicidal at one point. And through my band's music, they were able to find happiness and have fun at the shows and like change their perspective. And so when they told me that story, like it really hit me. And I kind of realized like, I'm not just making music to have fun on stage and play around and bash the crap out of some drums. I'm actually impacting people here. And in that moment, I just realized like, okay, like my mission in life, I think my purpose is to help people through the power of music, however that is. Like whether I'm a musician on stage, making sure that people have the greatest time in the crowd, or if I'm in the studio, it's helping bands see their ideas through and complete their songs, or allow those songs to go out and do the same thing that influence these girls and help these girls, right? So I think that that's something that really motivates me to keep going and to push music and to help people through music however I can.
Well, it's very cool. I mean, what you've created with Master Your Mix is really well done. And my very first impression is that you just have a great focus and skill at teaching people and trying to help, which is awesome.
Thank you.
And we're going to get into a bunch of that. I thought before we do it, before we get sort of deep in the weeds, tell us a little bit about your studio right now. Like we've got a little bit of video going now as we're doing the interview, and I can see you've got a cool drum. It looks like an electronic kit in the background there.
So I mean, currently I'm in my little home studio space. So I live in a condo, so unfortunately I can't make too much noise here. But I kind of have a duplicate setup here as I do. Like I have a commercial space in Toronto as well, and that's where I can make all my noise. But it's a pretty similar setup in a lot of ways. At the foundation of it, it's just like my MacBook with a Universal Audio Apollo Quad. I monitor off of some KRK Rocket 8s, which I know some people hate, but I absolutely love. And I've just listened to them so much that I've got to know exactly what to expect from them.
Yeah.
And then at the studio, that's where I've got all my mics, and I've just got enough mics to get going for a drum kit. I don't really believe in having like too many options because it just overwhelms me, and I'd rather just I know what to expect out of the mics I use all the time. And then I've also got some outboard gear, just some preamps. I have the Cappy preamps. I love those a lot.
Yeah, those are great. I have not had. It's Jeff right down here in Nashville. I want to have him on the podcast. I want to talk to him and learn more about it.
He'd be great. That guy knows so much about all those API boards.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I've got some of the Cappy preamps, some of the Hairball audio stuff as well that I built, and that in itself is just like a awesome thing to go through, and just like discovering the electronics and building it and making it work. So I think in that.
Those are the DIY ones, right?
Yeah, those are like the DIY kits. So I built all that, built my lunchbox full of preamps, and then I've got a Sam Audio LA2A clone, and they also have a SSL bus compressor clone that I have as well. A distressor, a couple DBX 163 compressors, some Joe Meek mics and compressors as well. That's pretty much it. It's a pretty simple setup, but I find that the as time goes on, I'm using less and less of that outboard stuff, and especially with the UA stuff, it's just really allowed me to streamline my process and go in the box. And the plugins are pretty close, like whether they're a 1-for-1 clone or not, that doesn't really matter to me. It's a matter of if I can get the sound. And I have compared, like I use the Distressor plugin all the time, and I've compared it against mine, and it's like what maybe like a 5 on the threshold of my hardware unit is like a 6 on the plugin, and it gets me the same thing. So it's so close that like I hate that I have the Distressor in my racks just sitting there now. But
I mean, who knows? Maybe that's even just a gain change because of the interface, the A to D interface.
Yeah, it could be.
Or something like that. But
the fact that I can
I've been
get
using the Arouser here too. And it's great.
I haven't tried out the Arouser yet, but I've heard a lot of good things about that.
Yeah, no, I used the Distressor many times on records, but I never had one of my own. And I kind of missed it for a long time. And then I just got the Arouser recently. And it just makes me so happy to have it, to be able to use it on my Pro Tools sessions. It's just a super useful compressor. Not that we have to geek out on it too much, but Rockstars, if you haven't ever used a Distressor and you're wondering why, it's got a lot of variety within what you can do, and you can get so much control, and you can make things so screaming loud if you want to. It's just a lot of fun.
And the Arouser has a transient shaper in there as well, right?
Yeah, which just kind of lets more punch through or something like that. I mean, it's one of those knobs, like so many knobs we deal with, where you're like, I don't really know what this does. I just know if I turn it this way, it sounds cool, which is really all you need to know. Tell us about your podcast and your website and everything, Master Your Mix, because like you said, you're doing such a cool thing for everybody, teaching. When did you start that? And give us an introduction to it.
Sure. So I started Master Your Mix, I guess it was about 2.5 years ago. So it's still fairly new. But it just kind of started as a way of just helping people. I always found that whenever I was in the studio, there'd be one guy in the band who had the recording interface and would be like looking over my shoulder, asking questions about, what are you doing over there? And so like, I always geeked out over those conversations, trying to help people out. And so I thought, this is a cool way to give back to people, put it online. And also, like, I do a lot of mastering work as well. And it's kind of cool to be able to coach people through mixing. And, if people have questions, they can go to the website, learn a little bit more about what frequencies to pay attention to, all that kind of stuff, and get their mixes to a point where they're polished and they're happy. And then if they send me some mastering work, that's awesome. But at least like at that point, I know kind of what they've worked with, what they've done to their mix, because they've gone through some of the stuff I've taught them. So it's a pretty cool way to give back, and kind of it all comes circular in a way. But it kind of just goes back again to what I was talking about earlier, about just how I want to help people through music. And I think that there's so many people that can get sounds into the box, but then they don't know what to do with it. They just don't know how to process it and get the sounds that they hear in their head to come out in their mixes. And so that's ultimately what I'm trying to do, is just help people get the songs done, and then to a point where they're proud of, and they'll actually release it. And then those songs can have the impact that they should.
That's pretty cool. Have you had a good connection with your students, your audience, where you get the sort of the pleasure of seeing the results of that teaching, where you're seeing people release stuff?
Absolutely. Like I had one student who he actually did some one-on-one stuff with me in Toronto. And when he first started, he had no idea what he was doing. And, he's just like, I just want to like do some hip hop stuff. And I'm not even like a hip hop guy really, but just walking him through the process of getting the sounds in and mixing them and everything. And within about a year and a half or so of him learning through me, he ended up messaging me one day, and he's like, hey man, like, just want to let you know, like I just opened up a new studio in Niagara Falls, which, is close to where I live.
Cool. And
now he's doing it full time, and it's amazing. Like he's crushing it. He's doing amazing work, and he constantly sends me stuff to listen to. And I love that back and forth of working with my students as well, and just seeing the progression and how people are able to take their ideas and turn them into something wicked.
This show is sponsored by Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can go to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level. And you can start right now with my free introduction to mixing course, Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. And the best part is that these mixing techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you are in Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One, Reaper, or anything you can think of. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, or look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Let me jump back, rewind a moment, because I just wrote something down, a question I wanted to ask too that I thought would be helpful. You talked about, having this cool outboard gear in the studio, and everybody who's listening is like, oh man, that sounds sweet. I wish I had all that stuff. But then you followed up with, yeah, I'm not using it so much. I'm really gravitating towards the plugins and using UA. Maybe you could describe a little bit specifically, what does that mean? So somebody's like, wait, where and when do you not use the hardware, but you use a plugin instead?
Yeah. So I pretty much only, at this point, I use my outboard gear whenever I'm tracking. So I use my preamps, obviously, to get sound in, and I might add some compression on the way in. I try not to go too extreme with adding compression on the way in. But if it's a project that I know I'm going to be mixing, then I might go a little bit more, because I know what I want that end result to be.
Right.
But that's pretty much the only time I use my outboard gear. And then when it gets into the box, I love being efficient. I love having the recall. And especially because like I said about the distressor thing, like sure, I could use my distressor, but then I got to recall it and,
Right.
spend the time finding the pictures that I took of the session and dialing in those settings. And also, like, my studio is about a half hour away from where I live. So because I have the same sort of gear at home, I can just quickly dial it up when I have the plugins. And to me, that's just way more efficient, and I'd rather work that way. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm with you on that. I have a few different workspaces. I got an office in the house, got the studio, got my laptop, which might be with me. I got my phone, which is like, how much of our work is just simply responding to an email and finding that Dropbox link, copying the link and sending it to somebody. And the ability to easily knock things out from wherever you are and not be sort of disrupted by it or make people wait forever is really helpful.
Absolutely. It's just so much more efficient to have the plugins, and I think that they're pretty close. So
yeah,
that's good enough for me.
Do you ever use plugins in the tracking stage? I think Apollo allows you to record through plugins, right?
Yeah. So I don't have any outboard EQs, so I'll use the Apollo EQs more than anything. Occasionally I'll use some of their compressors as well, just because with the virtual world, you can have as many as you want.
Yeah.
So, I only have the one distressor and the one LA2A and so now I can have way more if I want. So
yeah. And
it's pretty great. And
then you're using them probably because, you've got them. And if you're doing a one mic overdub or something, you've got the mic running through through the compressor into the Apollo. And then at that point, it's like, what else do I want? A little bit of EQ or a little bit of something.
Yeah.
So it makes sense. Cool, man. Your podcast, you focus on teaching stuff that you're learning, but you've also done some interviews. I think you mentioned that you've had guests on like Sylvia Massey and David Batra, and I wondered if you wanted to share maybe anything you remember learning from Sylvia, for example, first off.
Sylvia is just crazy. Like I love that woman. She's got like the most creative approach to things. I think with her, I had read her book before I did the interview, and I would highly recommend her book to anyone who's listening to this. To me, it was just a matter of like, I love that there's no boundaries when it comes to her. It's like, if a band has some weird, wacky idea, she's like, let's do it. And I think that goes a long way in the studio because we're creating these experiences for the artists that come through, and they're coming to us because they trust our expertise and they know that we can get them the sounds they're going for. But then beyond that, like, there's this magic of being in the studio and working in the studio and having all the gear and just having fun. If you make the studio too serious of a experience, then it just becomes a bummer in a way.
Yeah.
So
it tends to want to make itself that way, doesn't it? Especially when people's careers and money are on the line and all that kind of stuff. People's ambitions.
So that's what I love about Sylvia. She's just like, okay, a band's got a weird idea. Let's do it. Let's have a great time. And they'll remember that, And I think at the time, I don't know if she's actually done this, but she was working on trying to figure out how to send signals through satellites to the moon, and she wanted to have like a moon delay.
Nice. I like that.
When she told me that, I was like, how? What? Who thinks that way?
I like the moon delay idea. I saw a video where she did a pickle filter. Yeah. And it was like the whole guitar sound. Maybe it was on its way from the amp to the speaker or something, but it went through wires into a pickle and then out the other end of a pickle. And then they were jamming out. And I think the pickle exploded in a bolt of lightning or something like that, But I think I just looked it up again because I had forgotten the title. It's Recording Unhinged. Excuse me. I didn't say that very clearly. Recording Unhinged, I think, is Sylvia's book, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's really pretty amazing looking. I haven't read it yet. I've seen pictures of it, but it's full of these incredible cartoons that look like, oh goodness, I just blanked on his name. Who's the cartoonist from like the underground comics era and everything?
I can't remember.
It's gonna
I'm not a big comic book, but I think she made them.
Oh, really?
I think she drew all of that stuff. I could be wrong.
That's cool. Well, anyway, whoever's listening, they'll be like, come on, Lidge, it's so-and-so. And it'll come back to me here in a minute. But just a really, really cool looking book. And, when you've got cool books in the studio, it's kind of nice to have something that looks great that everybody's picking up while they're hanging out in the studio. So,
And then and people will look at those books and be like, oh, can we try this? Like,
Yeah, there you go.
Have some fun with it.
And then you're like, cool, man, just booked an extra day.
It's brilliant.
Now, one of the other people on your show, David Batra, who I think is doing a bunch of rock records and stuff too. Tell us what you remember about interviewing him and what you learned from him.
David it's been a while since we chatted, but I just love his approach to working with bands and just working on the arrangements and getting the songs right before tracking everything. And he's just got a great attention to detail. And in a way, like David, he shares the same sentiment as Jack Richardson, who I shadowed for years. And to go back to when I was working with Jack, one of the best lessons I ever learned as an engineer was working with Jack. And I was shadowing him for a while, and he was doing a lot of great work. And one day I finally got the courage to say, "Hey, Jack, do you mind listening to a mix that I just recently finished? And can you let me know what you think?" And he said, "Cool, yeah, I'll listen to it. But if the song sucks, what difference does the mix make?" And it just like kind of set me back a little bit because,
Well, did he assume that your song sucked before he listened to it? That's
I don't know,
harsh.
but I don't know, but I appreciated that bluntness because it was so true. If you can spend all the time in the world working on a mix and making it sound super polished, but if the song's not there, no one's going to listen to it anyway. They might listen to it once, but it's not going to advance your career. No one's going to listen to that mix and be like, "Oh, that's a great mix. Like, it made that horrible song so much better." Like, nobody listens to it that way.
That's so true. And what's funny is the opposite of that is when the song is inspiring, you could give a shit about whether it sounds like the entire audio has a blanket over it or something. It's just like,
oh, for sure.
It's just cool. It might even be cooler that way. You might be like,
I think about that all the time listening back to some Motown stuff. Like, I love all that Motown stuff. And by today's standards, like, they're crappy recordings and they're crappy mixes in a lot of ways, but the songs are so good. And you don't even pay attention to the mix. You're just lost in the song.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that thing in live sound where it's like, if the band sounds amazing, everyone thinks it's the band that's great. But if the band sucks and there's like feedback and everything, like they're like, "Oh man, that sound guy sucks." Like the sound guy gets no recognition there.
I know. You need to put up like a wire cage around yourself.
Yeah.
So, I was having a beer with a friend of mine just Friday night actually, and we were listening, and they played The Strokes last night. Came on the speakers, and it's playing, and we're listening, and then I was pointing out to him, I was like, "Dude, listen, check it out, Chuck." It's like, listen, you can't even hear the drums in this mix, And it was like, but it was super exciting sounding. But when you really zoned in on it, you're like, during the singing, you almost don't hear any drums. You just hear like there's this wash of stuff in the background. And it reminded me that same thing. It's like this, when the song's groovy, when the vibe's right, what constitutes a great sound and a great mix may not be what you think it is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Might be
the song goes very far away. It's 90% of the mix right there.
Yeah. So one of your new books, I believe it is The Mixing Mindset, right? Or is that yeah. So tell us about that, man. Give us an introduction to the mixing mindset. What is it?
For sure. So the Mixing Mindset is a book that I wrote, came out in January of this year, which is 2019. And it kind of started just as an extension of some of the work I was doing with Master Your Mix and just trying to help people make more music and music that they're proud of. And kind of going back to that idea of a lot of artists I know are writing these songs. They've got the interfaces, they're getting the music in the box, but then they don't know what to do from there. And I know a lot of guys that are just sitting on music because they don't know what to do with it. So what I wanted to do with the book was give people a formula, like a process that at least I follow in every single mix from beginning to end in terms of the, I have 6 steps that I tend to focus on. So the 6 steps that I go through every single mix in order are that I organize my tracks. So when I'm organizing my tracks, I always deal with things like track naming, color coding, grouping, getting rid of regions that I don't need, condensing tracks, all that kind of stuff. So I start with organizing, then I do all my routing. And then when it comes to routing, I always work in the same way. So I always have my individual instruments go into a group. So all of my drums will go to a drum group. All my guitars go to a guitar group, vocals go to a vocal group, etc. And then all of those groups then go to a master bus. And the reason I like to work in that way is because then I can touch on any of those tracks at various points. So I can either work on a micro level of working on the individual drums, Or if I want all the drums to be louder, I can work on them there, or compress the drums there. Or I can work on the whole mix and kind of compress the mix or whatever to maybe compress the drums, that kind of thing. So that's the routing stage. From there, I always create a rough mix. When it comes to the rough mix, it's very simple. I try not to overthink the rough mix stage. I basically will listen to some reference tracks that the band likes, and songs that I know very well. And I use that as like my guideline for the rest of the mix in terms of sonic balance, the balance between track levels of the different instruments. And then I just simply throw up the faders to get them to like the balance that I think feels good. And I'll work on panning, check for phase, all that kind of stuff. And then that kind of works as the foundation for the next step, which is really digging into the processing and getting into the EQ and compression and all that stuff, and just really polishing up the mix. So in that stage, sorry.
I was going to say, so this is, I think we just hit stage 4, right?
Yeah.
And when you're setting up all your routing, are you already putting EQs on individual tracks, or do you kind of even wait till a little later? I just
wait.
Process?
I wait till the end. Like sometimes what I tend to do is I'll load things into a template that I've got that has all the plugins there, but they're all bypassed and they're all flattened. Mm-hmm. I don't worry about, like, I tend to find that whenever I have templates that have like pre-EQ'd things, I just end up hating it, or it's a distraction.
Yeah.
I'd like to know what's actually there. And then build from there.
We both come from like an audio school background, and one of the things they teach you in audio school is zero the board, zero the console, right? And so in between sessions, you have to go back and reset all the EQs to zeros and stuff like that, so you're not leaving pre-EQ for the next engineer, next song, next mix.
Yeah, and sometimes if someone's sending you a track, like you don't know what they did to it on the way in, so like there might be a boatload of EQ already. And, you know, if you have a preset in your template that has like a massive top end boost or whatever, like it's just going to be super distracting to start. So you might as well zero the board and start fresh. So yeah, that's basically like when I process tracks, I go through a series of questions that I ask myself every time about each instrument, and I work in the same order. And this is something that I picked up when I was working in the audio post industry. I remember at the time, I just come out of like doing some of my own work, and it would take me days to finish mixes. And then I ended up getting this job at an audio post place, and I was working as a mix assistant. And the first day I loaded up this mix session, and it had like, I don't know, like 200 tracks or something like that. And it was like a 2-hour film. And I remember saying to the head engineer there, like, how much time do we have to work on this thing? It's like, oh, we got to do this in 2 days. And I was like, 2 days? Like it takes me like 2-3 days to finish a 3-minute song with like 20 tracks. Like what? How is this possible? And so he's the person. His name is Alan Ormerod. He's the guy who I really learned this concept of having a repeatable workflow from. And he did the same thing every time. He like analyzed his tracks a certain way. He worked in the same order every single time. And at the end of all of that, he'd be like, cool, I think it sounds good enough to like show the client. Let's see what they think.
Yeah.
And then from there, like we'd fine tune. But so I started implementing a lot of that into my mixing workflow. And that's what this whole book is about, really.
That's interesting. So, my brother did something like that. He came from the music world as a performing musician, as a composer, and he got hired on to do a TV show. And it was his story was funny because he was kind of like, yes, I could do Pro Tools, even though he didn't really know how to use it. And then he calls me up. He's like, Lidge, what do I need to know about Pro Tools? And, you know, first day at the job is 200 tracks and everything's due, you know, in an hour or whatever. And he would describe those meetings with the clients, you know, the corporate meeting room, and you press play on everything. And like if the tambourine sound didn't land when the tambourine was hit, everybody would freak out.
Yeah.
Anyway. That's funny to hear you talk about that story too.
Well, I mean, that's kind of like the foundation of it. Because once I realized that, it just made me realize like, yeah, at the time I was just bouncing between tracks, and whatever caught my attention was what I worked on. And that's an awful way to work. Like, I think there's a lot of people who approach their mixes more from a perspective of like, what problems do I hear, rather than what does the mix actually need. Yeah. And because I think when you search for, when you are looking for problems, you're always going to find a problem. And you're eventually going to go so far that you undo all of your hard work, because you don't know when you're done. You don't know how to keep track of your progress. You don't know what you're really listening for and what the song actually needs. Like you're just looking for problems. So, I like having this approach of here are the steps I do, and I can just keep track of where I'm at and I know what the next step is going to be. I know what I'm going to ask myself in terms of, what does this track need? And then I move on from there, and I just keep going until I get to the very end. And then at that point, I'm done. And I sit back and I send it to the client and see what they say.
And that was that step 5 in there or step 6?
Sorry, I kind of jumbled up that whole process there.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah, so first step is organization, second step is routing, third step is rough mix, fourth step is the heavy lifting. Then the fifth step is when I add all sorts of if it needs it, I'll add special effects into the mix. So adding things like delay or reverb, that kind of stuff. I think that there's a big tendency a lot of people have, especially early on, when they discover reverb. Everyone wants to add tons of reverb to the tracks.
Yeah. Let's get into that in a minute after the break too, because you got a great video that really gets deep into that topic.
Perfect. Yeah. So I just think like so many people just jump to these effects. It's like, oh, but that sounds mixed. When I listen to recordings, there's reverb, so I guess that's what it needs. But you can definitely go too far with reverb and delay and any other effect, really.
Yeah.
So I always like to just think of it from an outside perspective. Like, what does the song actually need? What's it going to add when I add these effects to the mix? Is it going to add energy to it? Is it going to create size and depth and width in the mix, or some modulation? Like, what is it doing? And does it really need it? And so I kind of go through a series of questions there. And then lastly, I get into automation. And automation is just the final little bit, icing on the cake, just like boosting choruses when they need it, adding a little bit more energy in there, accenting certain hits, automating maybe a delay throw on a vocal, that kind of thing. But pretty much at the end of the automation stage, I'm done. Once I've gone through every track, I'm like, okay, I have to be done. Like, I can't, if I go back now, I know I'm going to undo my hard work. Yeah.
Step 7 is the notes that come back in email from the client, right?
Exactly. So then I'll send it to them and see what they say. And often the notes that you get back from people aren't, hey, can you boost like 520 hertz on the guitar or whatever? Like, nobody's getting super technical. At least most musicians aren't. Most of the time it's just like the volumes. Like, it's like, can you turn up the guitar? Or like my vocals are buried, that kind of thing. But I find a really good tip for helping with reducing revisions is find reference tracks that the band likes and use those as your guideline, because that's what they're comparing your mix to. So right. So for example, like I recently was working on a band that I thought it sounded a lot like Green Day, and so I kept referring to Green Day as we were working, and the band didn't like Green Day, and they would constantly be like, oh, like we're into like this band Alkaline Trio or Strung Out. And so when I started mixing, like I knew those bands and I like those bands too. So when I started mixing, I started listening to those bands and I realized like the balance of tracks in those mixes was very different than a Green Day mix.
Right.
And so I knew the band didn't want the vocals to be super loud. They wanted them to be a little more tucked back and have the guitars more forward. And that's what I used as a foundation for my mix and tried to get that similarity there between the two tracks. And ultimately, on that project, I had no mix notes, which was amazing.
Well, that's pretty cool. It reminds me of a time I was working with a female artist, and she was trying to describe stuff she wanted in the track. Then finally, she plays me a reference, and in the reference, the vocal was just really dark sounding, And so I was like, oh, you mean kind of like this? And then I just took the high end and just kind of rolled it off of her vocal. And all of a sudden she loved it. And it was like, I never would have done that otherwise. I wouldn't have thought to just like cut out all the highs, just a random thing. But it reminded me of that, the power of reference tracks. And especially when you're mixing, it just really helps so much. It's so easy to get, off on a tangent or derailed, or you get the human brain and the human ear gets used to whatever it's hearing so quickly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I wanted to make a comment too. Like I came up with a great quote based on what you're saying. It's the problem with looking for problems, Yeah. And it reminds me too of like listening to that Strokes record. I encourage you rock stars to listen to songs on the radio or on, streaming or whatever, and listen for them in terms of what does this mix sound like? And if I was working on the mix right now, would I jump in there and adjust something? Because I think you can be really surprised at how often you would continue to work on something that's already a hit song and probably screw it up, which is that, like you're saying, it's like knowing when to let the song be where it's at, or the mix, because it has what it needs to have the right feel for that track, and not just keep looking for problems. Like you could probably listen and be like, ooh, you know what? I could bring out some more point on that kick drum, or ooh, you know what? This we need a special effect, or we need to turn down that tambourine, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And you would end up like kind of spoiling what was so cool about the
For
mix.
sure. And that same thing applies when you're in the tracking stage too. Like I think there's a lot of people who want to add lots of layers of stuff, and it's a really good thing to take that 10,000 foot view of it and just be like, okay, well, do I have the feel of this track here? Is it there? Is the sentiment of the song there? And if that's the case, then leave it.
Yeah.
Don't just add things for the sake of adding things.
Indeed. All right. Well, so let's take a break for a sec, rock stars. A reminder that we've got links to what we're talking about in the show notes, including a YouTube playlist where you can check out Mike's records and some of his great teaching videos. And we'll be back in just a moment. We're going to dig into stuff like, what's the difference between reverb and EQ? Reverb and delay on your mixes, and how to think about those. Also, we'll probably dig into talking about EQing your vocals on a mix and getting low end right too on small speakers. So we'll see you in just a minute for the jam session. Are you using a Mac in your recording studio? Are you tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly? Wouldn't it feel great to have a trusted friend to help you keep your existing Mac and studio setup current and relevant so that you can focus on the thing you love most, which is making great music? Well, now you can rely on OWC, Otherworld Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, whose mission it is to help you get the most mileage out of your existing Mac. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD drive, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac that's ready to rock, OWC will help take your studio far into the future with a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49. Why get frustrated and ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. If you want to design and build a great house, then you're going to need great tools. You could build it with an old hammer and some nails, but it's a whole lot easier to use an air compressor and a nail gun. Well, the same thing goes for mixing. If you really want to create a pro-sounding mix, then it makes a lot of sense to start with a great toolbox of awesome plugins. This is where Boz Digital Labs comes in to help you get killer mixes easily, quickly, and creatively. Provocative will make your vocals sound lush and wide. Transgressor and Manic Compressor can help your drums leap out of the speakers. Gatey Weighty and Big Beautiful Door offer unique new ways to tighten up your tracks, while the Wall will make sure your mixes are in your face and competitive. And my favorite is Sasquatch Kick Machine, which can transform your kick drum from sounding like a home studio cardboard box into the perfect punchy kick without using samples or triggers. To download your unlimited trial of any plugin now or get one of Boz's free plugins, go to bozdigitallabs.com and put the best in your mixing toolbox. Click the link below in the show notes to learn more. If you want to capture every nuance of a great performance in your studio, then you need to start with a microphone that is crafted with great care and attention to detail. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia designs amazing sounding microphones that are handcrafted with jeweler's precision to bring you incredible detail in your recordings. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique Golden Drop capsule design, which uses a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity while avoiding distracting colorations and distortions. Make sure to check out the Black Hole series BH1S and BH2 with the awesome looking hole in the middle of the mic, combining innovative industrial design with meticulous electrical engineering to help your studio sound incredibly expensive for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, if you use the coupon ROCKSTAR, you will get an astonishing 50% off. I got one. You're hearing my voice right now on the BH1S. So what are you waiting for, rock stars? Go to jzmic.com or click the link in the show notes below. Hey, rock stars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Mike Indovina, joining us from Toronto, Canada. And you need to check out his site, masteryourmix.com. He's got tons of great teaching material there. We're going to jump into some topics now, getting specific about mixing. Mike, you ready to jam?
Let's do it.
Awesome, dude. Tell us about, we were just talking about reverb versus delay in mixing, and you've got a great blog post and YouTube article where you really break it down, but I thought we'd steal the show and make you tell us right here on the podcast. No, tell us what that means, because I remember learning a little bit about and discovering that at one point, and in your teaching, I'm like, yep, you're hitting the nail right on the head. So ready, set, go.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I think when it comes to reverb, like reverb is a long, drawn out sound, and it's very easy to make your mixes sound muddy when you have these long, drawn out notes overlapping everything else in the mix. And whereas delay is like a quick repeat and it's gone.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking to add depth to your mix, like both of these tools can do it, but one of them is way cleaner than the other, and that is reverb. That's delay.
And also, reverb is actually just a shitload of delays.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Like
it's the reflections of it's a lot of delays bouncing off everything else in the room kind of thing, right? So yeah, I generally tend to lean a little bit more towards delay to add the depth in there, but it's in and out and it's not overlapping everything, and it makes your mix sound a lot cleaner. Especially if you're working on like a big power ballad or something like that where the tempo is slow, then reverb can fill in those gaps really nicely. But I tend to work on a lot of faster stuff, and if you have those long notes drawn out, it just makes everything sound like mud.
Yeah,
so
Or as you mentioned, I think on the video, it's like if you're doing a Mazzy Star or Adele's new single, then maybe like big reverb is the right thing. But especially for rock, it just can get in the way.
Yeah. I mean, back in the 80s when everything was a ballad and like, there was so much space and the tempos were slower, it was a great tool, but I think now things have picked up a little bit more and or at least in a lot of pop music, and I'm very much into like a lot of pop punk and that kind of stuff. So it's all fast tempos, and if you have these long notes drawing out throughout the whole mix, it just makes everything sound muddy. So delay is often a better choice.
Yeah. And do you want to describe what sort of a delay might be a cool one to start out with?
Yeah. So I tend to always make sure that my delays are synced to the tempo of the song. If it's an effect, like if I'm going for like a repeat of a specific word, then, I make sure it's either a quarter note or a 16th note or 8th note, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But for singing, instead of reverb, especially with the faster stuff, I'll often have like a slap delay, or I'll do two different delays, like one on the left side, one on the right, maybe set to like 110 milliseconds on the left and 220 on the right or something like that, just to give you this idea of the bounce back that you would hear in a venue, and to give that depth, but it's in and out really quickly. And I don't really use a lot of feedback on it, so it's just the one repeat and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it just, I guess, just to reiterate what you're saying, it gives the effect of your voice leaving your body and going over and hitting the wall and then bouncing back. So it gives a sense of space. And sometimes a little bit in a subtle way, our human brain is so tuned into picking up on those visualization and spatial cues that's enough to just give a sense that this voice is in the space with the band now.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. And then anything else about reverb or delays that would be that you want to touch on, or should we move on to another one?
I guess if you are going to use reverb to create, like I use reverb a lot on drums, like just to simulate the sound of a bigger room. If you're recording in a small bedroom, you're not going to have the depth there. So, you can get away with having some reverb on drums. But I tend to use, kind of in a similar fashion, I'll use like gated reverbs on snares so that you get that quick blast of room and then it's gone. Yeah. And then I'll try to sync that up with the tempo of the song as well. I think that's a really important thing. It's just like, make sure that you're using delay times or reverb times that work with the tempo, because then you can shorten it to fit your mix.
Yeah. It's almost like, learning to think about these effects as part of what's going on with the music in a song, and then extending that, learning to think about everything in your mix as an extension of what's going on with the music, which is an extension of what's going on with the song. Mm-hmm. And like the places we get ourselves into trouble is when we begin to think about them as two different things. It's like, got the song, got the mix, effects is this other thing that just kind of makes it cool. And it's not. It's like, it's as simple as this. The tempo of the song and putting a reverb on or putting the wrong kind of delay on changes the quality of the sustain of the note of the instrument, and then if it doesn't fit, it makes it sound bad. And if it does fit, it makes it sound hopefully great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's like comparing it to the live sound world. Live sound is one of the hardest things to mix because every room is different.
Yeah.
And you're often blasting sound into these big rooms that has a lot of mud bouncing around. And that's why it's like, when you watch a band in an arena, it's hard to make it sound really nice and clean and polished because there's sound bouncing everywhere. Yeah. And that's essentially what reverb is. It's creating that space and that size, but you can make things sound a lot tighter and more polished and clean by having a shorter reverb time or shorter delay.
It's interesting. I suppose live mix engineers probably also have templates and have to because of speed. But at the same time, based on what you just described, you really have to trust your ears because each space is different from the last one. And, a thing about live sound is it's sound reinforcement. So you have, depending on if it's a really big venue, you're not hearing much coming off of the stage. So everything's coming out of the monitors. But if it's like a small or medium-sized room, you hear the band coming and what you hear out of the PA is additive. Whereas in the studio, it's all you get, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we don't have to go too much into live stuff, but you also have another great video where you talk about ways to EQ a vocal in a mix. And I thought it was really cool, man. I thought you really hit on some great points and details about places that you really kind of just did some subtractive EQ and then one last little bit of additive EQ. But I wondered if you want to kind of get into that topic and break that down a little bit.
Sure. I mean, that's kind of my general approach to adding EQ to begin with. I prefer to do more subtractive, more as a way of like cleaning up the track and then adding whatever is necessary at the end.
Yeah.
Because if you just keep adding EQ to everything, it's additive. It's between all the tracks, you're just going to be constantly adding more and more gain and you're going to lose your headroom. And it's just, it makes it harder to mix.
Well, and you might also be just doing too much to something. Whereas subtractive, which can also be viewed as corrective EQ, is just simply trying to address something that maybe got into the mic that didn't need to be there, right?
Of course. So I think that allows you to really clean things up. And, if you can keep adding like top end and top end and top end on all these tracks, but eventually you're going to just end up with something that's super bright when maybe all you needed to do in the first place was just cut some top end on one instrument.
Right.
And you get the same result.
Yeah. And also when you talked about setting up your routing, let's say the drums just need to be a little bit brighter. It's a different sound if you sort of brighten the stereo mix of the drums than if you go in and try and brighten every single close mic of the drums. You start to get a lot more phasing between all these different mics and stuff. But let's
it's just quicker too.
So with that concept in mind, corrective EQ is about sort of like pulling out things that you don't like in a sound and sort of removing them from distracting what you're hearing. Keep talking about some of the different frequencies that you find really useful I know every vocal is different, every mix is different, but it was great in the video to hear you talk about these as great starting points. And so many of our listeners are just like, it's great to hear you guys talk about this, but come on, give me some details. So give us some of those frequencies that are fun to go try out right now and take a look at.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing when it comes to the subtractive stuff is really trying to clean up some of the low end rumble of your room. I find that with a lot of voices, you don't need that like room tone that's kind of in there, right? So I'll usually use a high pass filter, kind of clean up any of that rumble. My approach to high pass filtering is that I usually just insert it, start to sweep the frequencies until things start to sound thin, and then I'll back it off. And I generally do that with most of my tracks, just to clean it up. And then from there, I'll think about, well, what's the proximity effect on the vocal going to be like? Am I hearing that? If I am hearing that extra boost in low end, especially when the singer moves closer and further away from the mic, like I'm talking right now, maybe 6 inches from my mic, but if a singer moves closer, all of a sudden you're going to start to hear more low end, right?
Right.
So that can happen in the studio. So if that starts to happen, then I'll tend to look around 150 hertz. That seems to be a range where you'll get a lot of that proximity. And either using like a dynamic EQ, that's a great way to do it. If it's a proximity effect thing where it only happens for like a split second, you can use that to control that range there. Or if it's kind of constant, then you can have a static cut there. Then moving on from there, I tend to find that a lot of singers have nasally voices as well. That seems to be the one spot that
Not me, man.
Not you, man. You're like Barry White.
No, I'm just kidding. I got plenty of nasal. I'm all nose.
Yeah. So in terms of like the nasally sounds, or like if you're hearing like a lo-fi kind of radio sound, then usually that's kind of in the 1 to 2.5K range. So I'll sweep in there, just see if there's anything that's really jumping out, and then give it a slight cut. You don't want to cut it all because there's a lot of you get a lot of definition of the voice in that range too. And if you just cut it, it's going to sound weird and unnatural. But if you have a narrow Q size and you're just doing like a narrow cut, you can often get rid of those like harsh frequencies that jump out in there.
That's one of the things I remember learning early on from Brad Jones, is he pointed out to me that with a narrow Q, you can cut a lot more than you expect, and it's very subtle. You know, if you boosted a lot with a narrow EQ, you'd be like, ooh, I hear that, you know.
Yeah, that really jumps out.
But then like boosting, it's almost like an automatic place to start. Is like, hey, if you're going to cut, explore narrower EQs. If you're going to boost, explore wider EQs. I don't want to make it a blanket statement because, of course, there's a time to do everything differently. But those are a couple of good starting points as far as like understanding where the cuts and boosts could be useful, I think, right?
Yeah, you don't want to, and when you're searching for frequencies that you need to boost and cut, again, you also don't want to use that narrow Q because everything's gonna sound bad to you.
Right.
It's this like really whistly sound that's gonna jump out. So you definitely want to go a little bit wider, find the range that is jumping out at you, and then kind of refine from there and find those super problematic frequencies. Because if you're going with like all narrow Q, everything's going to sound bad.
Yeah. Well, let's say that one more time. So don't have a super narrow Q, have sort of but not super wide either. I don't have a number, but it
depends on the plugin too, right?
Right. So, but Rockstars, boost that and sweep it around until you hear a frequency that you don't like. And there may be a few, so don't worry about that. But like, let's say you're looking for the honk, sweep it around until you hear the honky tone. And then pull that back down to 0, and then pull that lower to start removing it, and then adjust the Q and make it narrow or wide and sort of feel out what seems to hit a sweet spot for you. So does that feel about right to you?
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. So yeah, that's kind of the next range that I would pay attention to with the vocal. And then after that, I tend to ask myself, like, does the vocal have enough top end presence to sound to cut through the mix, or does it sound like there's a blanket over it? Kind of like that one example you mentioned of rolling off the top end, right?
Right.
So yeah, if it sounds buried, then typically you're going to want to boost between like 5 to 8K to make the vocal sit on top. And then also if you need a little bit more intimacy in the voice and you want to hear some more of that like sexy, whispery kind of tone to the voice, using high shelves around 12K and up, that will tend to give you a little bit more of that crispy air and make the vocal feel like it's sitting much more forward in the mix. Now, if you bury it with a ton of reverb and stuff like that, you're going to lose all that intimacy as well, right? It's not going to sound like it's very forward, but yeah, definitely frequency-wise, that's where you're going to find that kind of stuff.
Well, so it's interesting. Another thing to think about just conceptually, as far as the way the brain interprets sound, when you talk about burying it in reverb, you know, a question you might ask is like, well, but if the vocal's up loud and it's got the highs in it and then you add reverb, how come it doesn't still sound forward? I mean, if somebody was standing in a room that's echoey and reverberant to you and they walked further away from you, it would be more in reverb. And that's why the human brain hears that as sounding far away and not forward.
Yeah. As you roll off top end in your mix, things are going to sound further away.
Yeah. And that stuff's always fascinating to me, you know?
Yeah, and I do that all the time with like just adding reverb plugins too. If I'm gonna have my drum sounds and I've got a really bright reverb, well, the drums are gonna sound much closer.
Right.
Whereas if I want to create this idea of a much larger space, I'll roll off some of that top end on the reverb so that it sounds further back.
Yeah, or even like I'm mixing a jazz record, even if there are times where I'm like, I love what the drums are doing, but this moment is about the piano. It's not about the drums. Rolling off some of the top and actually filtering out the highs and the overhead, which in a way seems counterintuitive. You're like, what? Well, I thought we're trying to have nice bright cymbals, but it all of a sudden made the track come together because it allows your brain to hear the highs from another instrument that you're like, oh, that is the one that's forward. That's supposed to be there. So that sounds right to me.
Yeah.
Cool, man. What else should we talk about?
What else we got?
Well, you had another great video where you talked about getting low end to sit right on small speakers, and I thought that would be a hip one to get into. Certainly,
for sure.
Certainly, nobody listening has ever struggled with low end in a mix.
Nah, low end's the easiest thing to do, right?
Yeah. So talk about some tips there.
For sure. I think that one mistake a lot of people make when it comes to low end is that they expect that in order to get your instruments like a kick and a bass to be heard, you have to focus on the low end, like the 80 to 150, 200 hertz range or below that, and just crank all of that. And all of a sudden you're going to hear their bass. But the problem with that is that it just eventually starts to sound like mud and it destroys everything else and the clarity of everything else. So often I find that a really handy tool to use is distortion. And to like infuse a little bit of harmonic content into your mix so that it will jump through on smaller speakers, but you're not just slamming the low end and making that super loud. Because especially if you just crank the low end and then all of a sudden you put your mix on a set of speakers that has a subwoofer with it, it's gonna be so boomy and you're not gonna hear the top end clear at all. It's just gonna be destroyed by the subwoofer volume.
Yeah, it's like you'll hear more bass in the mix, but you won't necessarily hear more bass drum or bass guitar. You'll just hear a big mush of
it's just gonna be like, like it's just like there's nothing. That was a really awful example of low end, but but yeah, it just sounds like a wash of noise, low end noise. So I tend to go towards things like distortion, especially on bass. Like I find that when I listen to my mixes, if you were to solo the bass in my tracks, it would be super distorted, and you'd be like, what? Like, this is what the bass sounds like, but in the context of the mix, you don't hear it. It just sounds like a bass, you know? But I tend to go pretty hard with distortion on bass tracks, and I'll often run it in parallel with like a cleaner DI track so that I still have that clean, focused bass, but then there's that super fuzzy one that's just tucked in there that adds a little bit of extra grit. So that helps it cut through.
That's such a great tip. And I remember going through that process. Sometimes you do have to just make all these mistakes to really learn them and understand them. And that's okay because you understand it better because you made the mistake. But like, first thing I did was crank up the low end on stuff thinking that would make it sound better. And then my mix would sound like shit. And then I was like, damn, why does this not sound good? And then what's sort of a mind bender to me was understanding that more bass in a mix was more often than not was less bass in my mix. Like having, it doesn't, how can I describe it? It's almost like by carefully leaving the space for the just right amount of low frequencies, everything from 100 hertz and below, it allows you, if you have it dialed in right, it allows you to crank it up more. And then all of a sudden you have this really deep low end, and when you just crank up the bass on all your tracks, you're filling up that space and it doesn't allow you to turn it up, and so it sounds muddy. But what was I going to say? So the distortion is such a great trick for getting things to read. And also we live in this world of digital workstations, where everything's so super, super clean. And a lot of the music we might be excited about maybe is, older than that. Older rock was mixed on consoles with tape, and there was a lot of harmonics added during the process of printing it to tape, during the process of going through, transformers and mic preamps and on consoles and mixing it. And so that would naturally have a tendency to sort of help you read the instrument a little more clearly.
Yeah. That's the reason why people say like, oh, analog sounds so much better than digital. It's because the design of those tools, like there's all these components inside that add extra harmonics in there.
Yeah.
So if you can recreate that in the digital world, then you'll get a very similar result.
But it does mean that sometimes we have to work a little harder. We have to be conscious of that and actually recreate that in the digital world. But something that I recently just learned about is, you know, a plugin that comes with Pro Tools is SansAmp, which is super cool, super useful.
That's like my favorite plugin.
It's a great distortion plugin. But what I didn't really realize is I had struggled a little bit at times using it in parallel with other tracks. And I've come to learn that it actually does have some phasing problems, and it can actually, you can actually get some cancellations in your low ends and stuff when you try and put it on a parallel bass track, for example. So something to be aware of. It may be better as the one plugin that you're adding to a track rather than parallel, or you may want to explore what some other, you know, some other distortion modules are out there too.
And I find that when I use the SansAmp plugin, I tend to because I'm running it in combination with like a clean DI track most of the time, the SansAmp track doesn't have all of that low end in there. Like I tend to make it sound a little bit thinner, and it is just there to tuck underneath the other track and give it that extra crispiness, I guess.
Yeah, and what I love about it, I've got an outboard one here too, but even with the plugin is you can really dial in just that little bit of mid-range and upper frequency distortion that lets you read the bass, but that you were missing on the track.
Yeah, same here. I have the, right in front of me, I've got the SansAmp RPM. I use that as my tracking DI for bass.
I've got that right over there too. It doesn't get used as much as I wish it did, but then when I listen to a track where I did use it, I'm like, wait, this sounds great.
Yeah. I use it every time I track bass because it's a great DI, and then you get the blend as well of that distorted, saturated sound.
And I know you can, Rockstars, if you're not watching video, so you can't see it, but I also have the original rack unit, which is before the MIDI controllable digital one. There are a lot of different SansAmps out there, and if you're into collecting all the outboard gear, it is pretty fun to collect them. I've got the guitar pedal too.
I also have that to my left, the bass driver.
There you go.
And they work great in combination with each other too.
So something else that you pointed out about it was you said, if you solo the bass, you're going to hear there's way more distortion in there than you expected. And the inverse of that statement is saying that when the distorted bass is blended in with the rest of the rock band and the tracks, you don't hear distortion on the bass. You just hear that now you can hear the bass in the mix. And so a point that we might add to that is reminding people that, yeah, well, when you break down for the verse or do the breakdown section, just like an effect, like a delay or a reverb or something that's turned up loud during the loud section, you may need to back that off, or you may need to actually mute the distorted bass during the sort of the open section, because you will hear it and it might sound too distorted. And that's another learning experience that we all have to go through, where it's like, you spend a lot of energy trying to kind of create this static mix where everything just rocks and it's just awesome all the time. But in the end, static is not going to work for everything. You get as close as you can, and then you get to a point where it's like, okay, now I have to manipulate. I have to do automation on certain tracks, or I have to simply mute things and turn them on and off during the mix for this to really work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like if anytime that you get like that second verse where everything just rings out and it becomes like a bass and drum thing with vocal, like that's a very common thing I find with a lot of punk arrangements, at least. You know, that's when like you just have to dial back a little bit on that distortion. Otherwise it's going to just insane. Right.
So, and you could you could automate dialing it back. You could just bring the level back of the distortion. You could, hell, just put up a different distortion track, mute one and unmute the other with like a slightly less gained up tone or something if you want.
For sure. And it's funny too, because I like bass is such a hard thing to get, and especially when you have like distorted guitars, right? So I actually tend to track bass after guitars. Like I used to do drums, then bass, then guitar, then vocals, and now I always do guitars second, because then I get the distortion, the fullness of the body of the guitars, and then I fit the bass around all of that.
Yeah, that's a good
and like
point.
find the saturation that fits with the guitar sound.
And you know, another funny thing about bass is, especially for really tight and accurate rock music, stuff that really needs to punch and not be sloppy, boy, it's such a different experience to cut the bass in the control room, where you can hear it over the speakers and you can get all that loudness and low end turned up and really like be precise with it, than in headphones.
Yeah, For sure.
I find that there's a lot more room to just kind of get the wrong distortions and the wrong tones in headphones and not notice it. And, you know.
Oh yeah. So many headphones are so mid-focused too that like, you know, it throws off your whole perception of the distortion.
Yeah. I was just realizing that this weekend as I was experimenting with some new microphones and listening and trying to see what I thought. And then I came in and listened to the recording and I was like, that stuff I was hearing in the headphones, it's not coming out of the speakers the same. So maybe I'm going to have to upgrade my headphone boxes. I don't know. This show is sponsored by Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you are ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I mastered my own record, Skadoosh, using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. These techniques would work for you in whichever DAW you are using right now. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads to mix in your own studio and even include in your mixing portfolio if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now and look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. But cool. All right, well, let's talk about some of your productions here just a little bit.
For sure.
There was one of the bands that you had on there, Hang Time, was this great speed rock band. I don't know what you called it. I forgot the term you just used. You had an expression for the style of music.
It's like pop punk.
Pop punk. There you go. Pop punk. Yeah. I'm learning. I'm forever a student, man. And one of the things I noticed about one of the guitar players in the video is that he did an interesting thing where like the intro of the song was all downstrokes on his guitar. And then when the verse started, he was doing down upstrokes on the guitar. And that's one of those details in doing rock music that you have to learn about as you're doing it. And I wonder if you wanted to talk about the importance of, you know, the way that guitars are being played and when it's appropriate, when it's not. Does that matter? Does it not matter?
For sure. I think that's like one of the biggest problems that I have with most of the bands that come through the studio. If I don't have a chance to do pre-production with them, it almost inevitably ends up being that the two guitar players in the band will play different strumming patterns from each other. And it could be that somebody's doing down up and someone's just doing all downstrokes. But I think it's super important to really focus on the strumming pattern and the strumming direction as well. You know, when you're doing all downstrokes, you're going to get a little bit more bite, a little bit more attack, and you're going to hear that pick a little bit more. Versus when you're doing down up, like it in theory should not sound very different, but it does sound different. And so, you know, trying to get bands to lock in there is huge.
And it's so true what you said about the guitars just kind of playing different stuff. And it's remarkable how the two guitar players might pick up on stuff by playing together and do these cool things. And then there's also these things that they just completely don't even notice about the other instrument.
Oh, for sure. There's always like one guy who's pushing a note a little faster than the other.
Oh boy.
That kind of thing,
yeah,
right?
there sure is. And that's like
it's almost easier just to have like one guy play all of the guitar tracks just so that it's like super locked down.
And what a curse of the engineer and producer. Like you develop such an acute sense of timing on what comes out of the speakers. And when a musician comes in and they just don't pick up on any of that and they're just way on top of the beat, it's just like, just poke me in the eye with a fork.
Well, I feel like, especially as myself being a drummer, like one of the earliest lessons that I had to learn was like lock in with the bass. And once I realized, okay, like I got to have a similar rhythm and like accent those same notes. Like once I started realizing that, it was like, okay, well, why doesn't everyone do that then? You know, like everyone should do it to sound tighter.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you have that one guy who pushes the note earlier than the rest, it just makes everything fall apart. So,
well,
you know,
with this weekend, when I went with my daughter to go get our fried chicken at our favorite fried chicken place, they play a lot of great old rock music, and they're playing
Hattie B's.
No, not Hattie B's. We go to McDougal's.
Yeah, okay.
Hattie Breeze is new. It's new. It's the new kid on the block.
Is it? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I was in Nashville in the summer and we went to Hattie Breeze and it was great.
It's the one that you'll read about in the magazine insert on the flight down to Nashville for sure. But it is the new kid on the block. But they were playing Ramones, and I was like pointing out to her, I was like, listen, kiddo, this is, if you notice, the guitars, the bass, they're all playing the same thing together the whole time, you know. But it's also interesting and reminds me that while you need to understand that, and there's a lot of power in everybody being unified, sometimes the sound of a band is that the one player is pushing a little bit, the other player is hanging back, and it's like it all adds up into just the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely true for sure. Yeah, I think that like my approach to it is I always watch, whenever I get into pre-production, the first thing I do is just watch the guitar player's hands as much as I can and just see what they're doing. And just, the problem I think happens a lot of the time is that people are playing in these loud rooms, they've got their amps cranked and like everyone's just into it in the moment and they're focusing so much on what they're playing. And you can't, when you're just in a big reverberant rehearsal space, like you can't hear those small details.
Yeah.
So it often helps to just strip things down and like play it acoustically and play it at like half speed almost, so that like you're forced to really think about every movement you're making and just watch each other, listen to see like what each person's playing. And that'll make you way tighter. Yeah.
So I've had guests on here talk about pre-production in the control room where you've got the band sitting around and everybody's air strumming on guitars, or you can hear the vocalist sing just naturally in the room. Everything's quiet. The drummer can just kind of like with pencils hit their leg or sticks and stuff. Mm-hmm. And it really does. It's like there's such clarity, and all of a sudden you hear that people are doing different things or they're doing stuff together, and that can really help.
For sure. And I can't remember who it was. I want to say it was Bob Rock who said that if a song can sound heavy as an acoustic song, it's going to sound monstrous when you add the amps.
That's cool.
Yeah. I love that. I think it's so true.
Well, and you know, being in the rehearsal space and turning things up loud, I know as a guitar player, sometimes I just hit a chord and I'm like, God, it sounds so good coming out of the amp, you know? I'm having so much fun just listening back. I'm not paying attention to just being precise with what I'm playing. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons why those things happen. And it's so important to get all the strums right. I even wrote that down, the importance of strum, you know? Mm-hmm. But like, I don't know how it is in the kind of pop punk stuff, but I know in songwritery world and rock stuff, there's a great deal of cues for the guitar strums that come from the lyric and the vocal.
Absolutely.
And then same thing with the kick drum pattern on the drums. A lot of cues come from the vocal again. It's like accenting based on the lyric.
That's a whole art in itself, being able to understand those cues. I have a good friend of mine, an old roommate. He is probably one of the best piano players I know. And there'd be times when I'd come home some nights and just be like, hey, man, what are you up to? And he'd be like, oh, I have to learn 150 songs tonight. And that wasn't an exaggeration. Like he would do it. And I'd be like, how? Like, you don't even have that much time to like listen to the songs.
150 songs. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And he would just listen to like half a verse, half a chorus, and he knew the song in and out based on like vocal things. And currently he's playing on tour with Shawn Mendes. And I remember talking to him about that. And I was like, how'd that gig come about? And he's like, oh, I got a phone call being like, hey, do you want to play with Shawn Mendes? And he's like, hell yeah, of course. Like, cool, get on a plane in 4 hours and we'll see you in Europe. And you're going to show up like hours before the gig and you're just going to hit the stage and go.
Yeah.
And like, great. And he's like, so I learned the songs on the plane, you know, like, you know, there's so many things that you just have to pay attention to in the context of the arrangement that will lead you to play the right rhythms and everything.
What are some of the things that come to mind for you as a producer and an engineer and a mixer as far as this, where it's important to be able to speed learn what you're working on? I guess you talked about like, you know, the mixing process and not tweaking everything until you end up with like a perfect beige mix.
I think so. One thing that I used to do with my bass player, and it kind of just started as almost like a joke for us, but it really helped us hone in on each other's rhythms and patterns, was we used to like mouth each other's parts to each other.
That's so important.
So he'd be going like boom, 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 or whatever. And I would sing that to him as I was playing drums and like to show that I knew it. And he would see if he can match the drum pattern. And that made us lock in so much better. And it was kind of like just a fun thing, like, oh, like I know your part so well, and like, do you know mine? Like,
yeah, no, it's a great insight. I mean, I actually try and get people to do that all the time here. Like a drummer, I'm like, how do I explain what the drum part is? I go like, eat more bananas or something, like whatever it is, and it's like, and that's the part, and that kind of stuff helps. But when people aren't used to that, sometimes they look at you like you're crazy. But I like what you just described, and it's almost like there's a mutual musical respect too, to saying like, I'm going to demonstrate to you that I'm listening to what you're doing enough to know what your thing is.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
It's funny that you said the eat more bananas thing, because that band Hang Time that you had asked me about, their drummer would do that all the time. Like anytime there was any sort of discrepancy of, what's the rhythm, he had this like amazing talent of being able to put together a phrase that would work perfectly with the rhythm. And he'd be like, down with the belly flop, down with the belly flop, or whatever, and it's like, what?
It's much better than eat more bananas.
Yeah, well, whatever. I mean, whatever the rhythm is, I guess, right? But he always was able to like sing these weird phrases that matched the rhythm perfectly. And all it took was like one or two listens to that line, and everyone knew what to play.
I'm writing that down with the belly flop. I remember some of the first ones I learned about, because they would joke about them in sessions here. It was like Pat Boone, Debbie Boone. That was like one of the drum fills. And then there's bucket of beans. I'm sure there's like 10,000 others, but those are the ones that stuck out.
Yeah.
Very cool, man. Well, so importance of paying close attention to what's going on with the strokes of the guitars, the strumming, the kick and the bass going together. Those are really interesting ones. That's the first thing to learn is like the bass drum and the bass guitar. A first thing to learn is play the same thing together. A second thing to learn is don't just play the same thing together, because it's more complex than that, more interesting. But one of the things that I repeatedly run into a struggle too is the push beat versus the downbeat in choruses and stuff. Because you might have a vocal that pushes, or the guitars push, but does the bass and the kick drum push in the drums? Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts about like the push beat versus the straight beat? And do we need to explain what that is?
Yeah, I guess, in terms of the strumming pattern for a push beat, it's like you get that one person who's just jumping to that note like a half second early.
Right, and this isn't playing on top, Rockstars. This is like, jun, jun, chugga, chugga, jun, chugga, chugga, jun. Those are push beats right there.
Yeah, especially in punk rock stuff, like there's so much of that. I don't have a preference. It really, like what I say to every band that comes through the door is like, look, like if we find somewhere where we have a discrepancy in terms of the strumming pattern, or if I have an idea or a suggestion for the song, like let's try it out. Let's see what works. And if one of us if it's a bad idea, it's a bad idea. But let's try it and see what feels the best. And we can work through all the different variations of it to see what feels best. And that's just what you go with. Yeah. There's no real right or wrong.
Hopefully, the beauty of that too is we stress out about making the decision, but when you do what you just described, you let the music make the decision for you. Hopefully, like you try stuff in the studio, and hopefully the one that just sounds better is obvious. And then the beauty of it too is it's like, if it's not obvious, then who cares? Keep moving. Yeah. Like you just discovered that it didn't matter. A friend of mine, a girl she was actually reading to me. I'm going to get all religious here for a sec, but she was reading to me a quote from Ecclesiastes, and it was King Solomon who had this quote that said, "A tree falls north or a tree falls south. It doesn't matter because it's still in the same place." And she's like, "What does that mean?" I was like, "Oh man, that's super deep." but it's kind of like what you just described. It's kind of like, let's try this thing in the studio. Let's try that thing in the studio. If you discover that one doesn't sound better than the other, that's okay. Like move on quickly from it, because it just let you know that you don't have to worry about the push beat or the not push beat. But sometimes you do.
Yeah. Sometimes like if one guy is not doing it, but everyone else is, then, that's an issue. Yeah. Like let's lock in. Yeah. But if like half of the band's doing one thing, half the band's doing another, it's like, okay, well, let's try them out and see what sounds best.
Well, I had just recorded a bunch of my own songs in January. And one of the things that I learned was on some of the songs, those guys, they couldn't see my hand strumming the guitar through the glass because my glass is a little taller than the guitar. Learning lesson number 1 for building my studio, make the glass low enough so that you can see through it and see somebody's hand strumming a guitar. Somebody's going to be super glad I just said that on the podcast.
Oh, it's huge.
Somebody who's listening right now is about to build a studio is like, oh my God, thank God you just said that before I, built the window in my control room.
Oh yeah.
But in some of those instances, the songs were simple enough that they could just kind of hear what the beats were and what the strum pattern is. But on some of them, it's too masked by my cray distortion on the guitar, And if they could have seen my hands, then we would have locked in on those certain details. So
for sure.
All right. That's enough talking about hand strums. Important stuff. Let's see here. Okay, another guitar question. We've got a rock band. They're a trio. There's one guitar player in the band. What do we do? Where does the guitar go? How do we mix this? How do we produce it?
So, yeah, I guess it really comes down to, it depends on the context of the song and the arrangement, I think. If it's like a stripped down song, then, you can sometimes get away with a single guitar. For example, one of the tracks I just recently worked on, there was this quieter rock song where it was just the singer starting off half of the song. The first half of the song was just one guitar and vocals, and that was it. And so I chose to just make it the singer on stage. I was envisioning if I was seeing this band live, what would they be doing? And just the singer singing on stage with his guitar, and we just kept it panned up the center. And then when the rest of the band came in, then to add size, I panned out everything and made the doubles and all that stuff. Generally, my approach to it is if it's a full band thing, everyone's kind of blasting their guitars and drums and everything, then I'll double up the guitar parts and pan them left and right. Usually I'll take one lead track and pan that center, or depending on what else is going on. If there's some sort of delay thing on the guitar, I might pan the lead a little outside of the delay. But that's kind of it. I usually just try to keep it simple. I don't quad track guitars, or I know some people it'll go eight layers, and I've tried that and it just starts to sound muddy afterwards. So I just like to keep things simple. Punk rock simple.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the reminders though is when we do double a guitar, it has a natural, tendency to chorus it out a little bit. It actually can push the guitar back a little bit as well, right?
And again, that's when you're doubling guitars, that's where it's also very important to just even know your own strumming pattern.
Right, which was surprising how little we know our own part.
Yeah, everyone just kind of feels it out. And then afterwards they're like, oh, did I push that note? Know your part.
Yeah, and another thing is I've discovered this, funny enough, in tuning vocals. So if I do a vocal and then a double and I take it over to Melodyne to go tune it, I might hear a single vocal in Melodyne and think, oh, that sounds just fine. But then when I add the double and I make sure the double is following all the same notes as the lead, all of a sudden the thing that wasn't right at all stands out. Mm-hmm. And I imagine it's really kind of the same thing with the doubled guitars. It's the one guitar just feeling it out may seem to kind of work, or you didn't notice it so much. But like you said, when you double it, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, are we going to do a push beat there? Or are we not going to do a push beat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for your vocal comment, I almost always will I almost always double vocals with just to have in the mix. And then choruses, I usually bring that in just to fill it out and make it a little wider. Right. But I almost always immediately vocal line everything as well.
Right.
I just love that plugin. Once I got that, it was on everything I did.
All right, so I don't have it right now. I've used it in the past, but tell the rock stars what vocal line is. It's not vocal line, it's vocaline, right?
Vocaline.
Vocaline. Yeah, tell us about it.
So basically what it does is you can set the input source, which everything else will sync to. So when it comes to a vocal, for example, you would take your lead vocal line and then import that into the plugin. And then you would use that as your guide track. And then on your dub track, you would import the double part. And with the press of a button, it will immediately kind of sync up all of the rhythms and the words together so that they perfectly align. Now, that only really works as long as the rhythm is close.
Right,
if it's totally off, then it's going to freak out a bit. But it's great for when you have someone holding a note at the end of a part. So, if they hold it for like versus one's a lot shorter than the other. So you got to figure out which one you want to keep, and then the other one will sync to it.
Yeah, it's always funny how much of a pain in the butt that is. And they sing it and they're like, oh, you nailed it, but it was a little bit short.
Yeah.
Can you make that one a little longer? And it's hard to judge exactly how long is the right amount of long, too, on the end of a note. Well, very cool. All right. Let us talk about some of our usual jam questions here and kind of jump in, and we'll kind of close out the podcast. When you started out in recording, what do you feel like was holding you back?
I would say it was myself more than anything. A couple things. I think there was like a lot of indecisiveness of what I wanted to do because I was bouncing around. I was taking every opportunity that came my way. So it was like I was in the studio, then I'd be doing post-production, then I'd be on the road, and like I couldn't really focus on running all three of those things at once. It was, whatever was in the moment. So, I mean, it was a good thing and a bad thing. Like, it was bad in the sense that it took me longer to get going with the studio, which ultimately I decided was the thing I wanted to do. But it was good in the sense that I learned a lot from watching other people and took so many skills from different areas that I now apply to my studio. So I would definitely say there was like, that was part of it. And the other part was just a lack of confidence in my ability to reach out to bands and network.
Yeah.
I was afraid to talk to bands after shows unless I was friends with them. But even then I wasn't like, I was never the guy to be like, hey, like I run a studio, we should work together. It was like, I kind of had this idea that if like I built a website with some examples of stuff, that my friends would go on Facebook or wherever and find my website link, and then they'd click on it, and then they'd listen to my portfolio and be like, hey, we should work together. But that's just like expecting way too much. Right?
Yeah, considering how many times in the day we do that for all our friends, it probably helps us understand why they might not be doing it for us.
Yeah, exactly, right? So now I definitely try to keep on top of my communications with people. And I know you and I, when we first started emailing back and forth, we were talking about CRMs and the importance of that.
Oh, that's right. We didn't get to talk about that. Oh, we can get into that. Let's.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like a CRM. So for people who are listening that don't know what we're talking about customer relationship management software.
Yeah.
And basically, the gist of it is
I thought it stood for crappy rock mix. That's what I was talking about.
You could be right. You could be right there. That's a plugin, isn't it?
Yeah, right. I'm working on it. I've been working on it for 20 years.
It's like the suck knob, but you put it in your plugins.
Oh man, and that's so old school too. That's the Far Side reference that goes back to like the 80s. Does it?
I think something like that.
All right, sorry, rock stars.
But anyway, so customer relationship management software. I think it's relationship management software.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Basically, it allows you to keep track of all of your projects and communications in one centralized piece of software. So what I found was happening years ago was that I would talk to a band and they would say, we're planning on recording a record at the end of the year, that kind of thing. And mentally, I'd be like, cool, I'm going to remember to talk to that band like 6 months down the road from now or whatever. And inevitably, like the week after, or maybe even like the next day, I would completely forget that I had that conversation. And at the end of 1 year, like I remember I had a couple of bigger projects that I thought I had it in the bag. Like I was like, yeah, I got these projects. It's going to be great. And then they had told me like, yeah, contact us in 6 months. And I totally forgot. And I contacted them in 9 months and they're like, oh, sorry, we went with.
Yeah, we just finished the record.
Yeah, we just finished the record. And so I kind of realized like, shit, like I need to remember to keep on top of this and like have some sort of way to remember that like I had this conversation with a band, what we talked about, and remember to reach out to them at the right time. So I use a program called SalesFlare, which I think is great. I think you use that too,
Yeah,
right?
That's the one that I've got too, yeah.
Yeah. And so basically anytime I talk to a band at a show, I immediately put it in my CRM and say like contact the band the week after. So like if I saw a band that I was really impressed by, I almost always talk to them after the show and say good show or whatever and try to just have a beer with them and be friendly or whatever. And then I'll follow up like a week later and just be like, hey, like I'm the guy that you met after the show and I thought you guys sounded great, whatever. And then I can go deeper into a conversation about like, what are your plans for the band? What are you guys up to? And, if they say we're writing songs right now, well, then I know, depending on where they're at with that, to contact them in a few months or
right.
whenever. And I just find that allows me to keep on top of my conversations and really just like every day my phone goes off and it says like contact so-and-so about whatever I left my reminder to be.
Right.
And that has been a lifesaver. Like there's been so many bands that I would have forgot to reach out to.
Let's break that down a little bit more, because I know from my own experience of getting a CRM, like you get it initially, you're like, oh, I know this is a useful tool. This is going to help. And then you look at it and you're like, oh my God, my brain's exploding. What is this thing? Talk a little bit about the actual detailed process, without getting too specific since if somebody doesn't have the same one, but generally, I mean, it's like you open the app on your phone. Now you're looking at the Sales Flare app and you're talking to the band. Are you entering their contact info into that, or do you put the contact info into the phone, or what?
Yeah, as soon as I know who the main contact is for that band, often it's a singer, I find.
Right.
As soon as I have their contact info, I immediately create what they would call like an account in the CRM.
Right.
And I put all the information that I know about that band, like who plays what, who their contact is, like what their Facebook page is, what their Bandcamp page is, that kind of stuff. So that like I can quickly pull up their account at any point and click on their links and have their music right in front of me. I know who to contact and which member of the band to reach out to. And sometimes people will add me on Facebook just as like individual members. So it's good to know who I've talked to outside of the band account.
Right. And the account equals the band, and then the contacts are the individuals within that, right?
You're right. Sorry about that.
No, it's all right. This is just the stuff that like perplexes my brain when I first see it until I begin to think about it the right way. It's like figuring out what folder goes inside of what folder on your Mac. Once you understand that, you're like, oh, that's so easy. Why didn't they just say that at first?
Yeah. So once you've created like the band account, and then you've got all of the individual contacts for each member of the band, you can do like a reminder. And I'm pretty sure every CRM allows you to do this.
Right.
So I'll put a reminder that says like follow up in 6 months about new music, or this band has 2 songs that they're working on. Ask them if they need help with mixing or mastering. And it's just like
I was going to interject. It's like reminders in your phone, except that because you might be thinking like, well, why don't I just do a reminder in my phone? But it means that when you open up this app, it's going to show you this like breadcrumb trail of your whole conversation and the fact that you made that reminder back when, and et cetera, et cetera. So, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, and it'll show you like any emails that you've had with that person in the past. So you can quickly recap everything you've talked about to that point and just have everything right in front of you.
Yeah.
And I just think it's huge. And it's allowed me to keep on top of a lot of projects that I would have forgot about.
Yeah, and you can like take notes. And I think it'll even make a note of when you talked on the phone too.
I don't think I have it synced to my phone, but yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff you could do. Some of them even let you have like templated emails within the software. So, you can be like, hey, first name, and it'll automatically insert the first name of the singer or whatever into it. So like, yeah, like I use templated emails in Google as well for a lot of things. I'm typing the same emails every day.
Yeah. And I'm using another tool now called Text Expander, which lets you do templated, if it's not like a full email, but it's like a sentence or a paragraph or like a link. You know how much of a pain in the ass it is to type in recordingstudiorockstars.com/something or other in your iPhone when you need your reading glasses like I do now. So like that will allow me to put in, X RSR, and it just goes bing and like puts in all this information. So that stuff can be really helpful, these tools.
I love programs like that. Like I recently got Keyboard Maestro.
Yeah.
And I use that for so much stuff in Pro Tools, like hit one button and it does like 10 buttons worth of key commands. It's the best.
So the stuff like that is really cool. It's really interesting. Rockstars, don't be discouraged by it. You do have to advance to the point of saying like, okay, this is actually a task I'm repeating every day, and I know that I want to make it faster. So I'm going to put in the time and effort to like create a Keyboard Maestro quick key that will let me do it quickly. So don't stress about it. You'll create your own custom stuff as you get to it and as it's useful to you. Batch Commander from Slate is like a version of that just lives in as an open app underneath Pro Tools. But then the other thing I just wanted to close out with the CRM thing is just remember these were designed for stuff that feels like pencil, pencil nose or pencil neck, or I don't know what expression, corporate world where you're like, this doesn't make sense. We're making rock records. Yeah. So you have to just push through that. You have to be like, okay, I know it's called an account, but it's really a band. And I know that, an automated email template, how am I going to send that to a band?
Yeah.
No, but you have to rewrite, you have to make it into your own language so that it makes sense for what you're using.
I think that so many studios don't think of their studio as like a business, and there's, I used to work for a music manufacturing company. Like we did CD manufacturing and stuff like that. And I was always the guy that was like Post-it note guy. Like I would just leave Post-it notes everywhere about like contact this person or here's this detail about something. And I remember my manager being like, what are you doing? Like, what if I take one of these? What are you going to do? And it just really like made me realize, okay, I need to like keep much better track of my notes, keep them all centralized, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's really where like I didn't even understand the idea of a CRM. Like but working for that company, I realized like, oh, like you can make a database of something and have all your contacts in there. And think of your studio as a business. Like that's, if you're trying to make a living off of it, you need to keep on top of conversations with people and follow up and put yourself out there as well.
Yeah, if you're only trying to make one record, then you don't need a contact resource management.
Absolutely.
But if you're trying to grow your studio as a business and do a lot of work, then by definition, it typically means you need to scale it beyond what you can just do, off the top of your head all the time, which is why these tools are so useful.
I don't even remember what I had for dinner last night.
Exactly.
So like, how can I expect to remember someone's email address?
My first discovery of that for myself was like working with a band in the studio, and I won't remember what we just worked on for 12 hours yesterday.
Yeah.
And I think it's like a survival mechanism too. I don't think you could edit the same song and work on it for 12 hours if you really, really remembered all that, because you'd go crazy, Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's just my self-defense. All right, well, so we're going long on time here. Let's go to our closing question here and talk about, it's a hypothetical question, but I want to take you in the Wayback Studio machine so that you could go back and find young Mike, who's playing drums and trying to, why won't the band remember what we just rehearsed yesterday? And you're going to go back and give yourself one bit of advice, which maybe is kind of close to what you just talked about when you were talking about what was holding you back. But what if you could go back and give yourself one bit of advice, say, here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio one day, what do you think you'd go back and tell yourself if you could?
I would it definitely ties to what we were just talking about, like get better at networking. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there and do the uncomfortable, like put yourself out there and be willing to get rejected a couple times. It's just going to make you stronger, and put yourself out there as much as possible. Like I can say that when I played in bands, like I played with so many bands that I loved and became great friends with those people, but I never followed up in terms of telling them, I have a studio, or I'm like, I'll record your band for a compressor or a microphone or something like that. I never tried that, It was only like the couple people that had been to my house and saw that I had the gear that I worked with, So if you're willing to put yourself out there and let people know what you're trying to do, and you follow up on conversations and all that, you're going to go much further.
Yeah, I know phones don't ring that much anymore, but I guess the saying would be like, stop waiting for the phone to ring and make the phone ring. Or pick up the phone and dial,
Yeah.
Smile in and dial in, as my friend Glenn says. So great. Let's thank you again for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us, Mike. It's totally awesome hanging with you, man.
Thanks for having me.
You shared some great tips on this, and it was really fun to talk to you about all this stuff. Let the Rockstars know how they can find you online, learn more about you. You've got a wonderful podcast out there, and I know you have some great free resources out there that they should be checking out too.
For sure. So first place, if you want to check out some of my work, you can visit mikeindovina.com. My last name is spelled Indovina. So check that out. And on there, you'll get a little bit of my discography, some samples of stuff I've done. If you're looking to learn more about improving your mixes, whether you're a musician or an engineer, check out masteryourmix.com. And on there, I've got a free download for your audience. If you visit masteryourmix.com/blueprint, I've got something I've put together. It's called the Ultimate Mixing Blueprint. It shows people how to use EQ and compression on a variety of instruments in your mix and walks you through the different characteristics of sound that you're going to hear for each instrument and what frequencies to pay attention to. So if you're wondering, how do I get the kick drum beater to cut through the mix a little more, it's going to show you exactly what to pay attention to.
That's great.
So check that out. Also, there's the brand new book as well, The Mixing Mindset. So that's available on Amazon, or you can visit masteryourmix.com/mixing mindset book. And that'll also take you to where you can get it. And what else is there? That's pretty much it. I mean, feel free to, if anyone's listening to this and wants to hit me up, like reach out to me on Facebook. I'm always on there and I'm always accessible. I just like talking to people.
That's great. And Rockstars, if you're not already using Kindle to read, I encourage you to explore it because it's so easy. If you have the Kindle app on your phone, you can literally hit pause on this podcast episode, swipe over, go to Amazon, find the book, buy it for however much it is, swipe back and keep listening. And then that's what I do when I find stuff I really love, like the book you're writing, where it gives me the chance to put these into my queue. And then I come back later and it's like, there's that book that we were talking about. So that's great, man.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. And also, sorry, you mentioned the podcast, so I should probably
please do. Please do.
So yeah, I have the Master Your Mix podcast. And on there, I interview a lot of different engineers because I think it's really important to learn from a lot of different people and kind of find your own sound as a result of the lessons you learn from everyone else. So make sure to check that out. It's all one word, Master Your Mix. For some reason, back in the day, I thought that was a great idea.
What else would it be, though?
Like the iPhone. Well, I guess if you can make each word individual, like master space your space mix.
Can you? I don't know. But you can't put spaces in a .com name, though.
That's true. I think that's why I did it in the first place, but
that's all right. So then I'm going to go listen to the Sylvia Massey episode, and Rockstars, I encourage you to do that. I'm trying to get Sylvia to come on my show too. So I know she's doing super cool stuff.
Yeah, she's doing a lot of great stuff.
Thanks so much, Mike, for joining us on the podcast. Totally awesome hanging with you. Can't wait to see you in the studio. Are you coming down to Nashville at some point? Will you be here for Summer NAMM or anything like that?
I will actually be coming to Nashville, I think, at least, probably around July or August. I'm getting married in October.
Oh, congrats, man.
Thank you. Nashville's my favorite city in the world. So I try to go there at least once a year. So I'm trying to get my buddies to go down there for a bachelor party week.
Yeah, well, they say it's the number one bachelorette party location in the world. So you should,
all those pedal taverns.
You should switch it to a bachelorette party for yourself and your friends, and then come on down and do it there. All right, man. Great to talk to you. All right, man. We'll see you around the studio, man. Cheers.
Cheers, man. Thanks.
Talk soon. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. Also, remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with these weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free mixing course at mixmasterbundle.com. Look for the link in the show notes. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio, all totally free. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.